Hey, hello and welcome everyone to the first Cartographer community meeting. Today is October the 20th, and well, we really appreciate that you are watching the recording or joining us live. Probably most of you are aware, but Cartographer is an open source project that was released on October the 5th, basically 2 weeks ago, released to the community, and community meetings are one of the communication paths we have with you all to discuss publicly the status of the project, the important stuff, and also to gather your comments, questions, and ideas. I will share the agenda link here. Get it. Put it in the chat. Oh. And let me share my screen. Okay. So first things first, we agreed that community meetings will happen weekly on Wednesdays, 8 a.m. Pacific time, 11 a.m. Eastern time, or you can convert to your time zone. You can reach us on the Slack channel. This is in the Kubernetes Slack workspace. So feel free to go there and start or continue the conversation there. The main goal of the agenda is to remain open, right? So if you have any questions, any topic you want to discuss, please add it to the open mic section. We will talk a little bit about the whole agenda format if we need to make some changes to it. We have also a Google group where you will find, well, if you subscribe there, you will receive the community meeting invites, so you can add it to your calendar and get proper reminders for it, and for any new or any news we need to share with the community, you will find it there. And also, well, the repo for the project is right there. These community meetings are, let's say, regulated by a code of conduct that is also public in the repo. In summary, is to be nice with each other, right? Okay. So for the meeting, we try to collect at the beginning who is attending the community meeting. If you want to add to your name the organization you represent, it's fine. If you don't want to do it, it's totally okay. It's useful to to be able to connect after the meetings and continue the conversation. So feel free to add your name to the attendees list in the agenda. Right, so well, we'll start with welcome to the first community meeting. And well, for most of the people out there in the community, we all, the Cartographer team, are new faces, right? So we would like to start by introducing the team. I will ask each one of you to self-introduce to the community, briefly, and your role in the project. By myself, David Espejo, I am here to make sure everyone in the community has what they need to feel, welcome and be able to progress and as a user, as a potential contributor, and to the project, right? So I don't know who wants to go next.
Yeah, I can go. My name is Dan Darponsi. I'm the PM on Cartographer. I'll toss it to Josh.
Hey everyone, I'm Josh. I'm the engineering manager on the Cartographer OSS team, and I'll toss it to Rash.
Yeah, I'm Rashid Abdulaziz, or Rash, and I'm an engineer on Cartographer OSS. Sorry, toss it to Emily.
Hi, I'm Emily Johnson. I am an engineer on Cartographer. Pass it to Sam.
Hi, I'm Sam Coward. I'm an engineer on Cartographer OSS. Pass it to Washuma.
I'm Wishima. I'm an engineer on Cartographer OSS. I'll pass it to James.
Hi, yes, James Rawlings. I recently joined VMware, so I'm working as a TL at VMware and love all things automation, continuous delivery. So also working with Cartographer. And I'll pass it to Stephen.
Hey, I'm Stephen. I'm also a tech lead at VMware, and I also work with Cartographer and contribute to the design. And I'll pass it to Kara.
Hi, I'm Kara. I'm the new senior engineering manager, which will include Cartographer. Should be starting today-ish. And I've been with VMware for about 10 years. I'll hand it over to Milan.
Hello, Milan. I'm engineer on Nocton team here, mostly just to learn about Cartographer. Pretty cool project. Oh yeah, and I'll pass it to Rashid. I don't know if you want.
No, I did, so I'll hand it to Todd.
I'm sorry.
If Todd's on.
Yeah, I'm Todd, also an engineer on the OSS Cartographer team.
I think just Marty, maybe.
Hi, I'm Marty, also an engineer on the Cartographer team. Looks like there's John.
Hey, I'm John, engineer in the supply chain tools program, and really interested in the intersection of secure software supply chain and Cartographer.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Okay, and being the first time we have this session in the public, we wanted to provide a brief overview of what the project is, and Daniel will help us with that.
Yeah, so at a super high level, I think most people on the call are familiar with this already, but for those of you watching the recording, Cartographer is what we're calling a supply chain choreographer that allows you to essentially stitch together a bunch of different Kubernetes and non-Kubernetes components into something called a path to production. And so the idea is that the person who is defining that path to production essentially will codify kind of all of the pieces that are required for that workload or for that application to get to production or to get to an environment. We also separate the kind of the division of control in such a way that developers, for example, only really need to worry about a very small subset of YAML, trying to keep it as minimal as possible in all things YAML in as many places as we can. So developers are worried about writing a workload.yaml, which really specifies the things that a developer would care about. So where their application lives, any kind of environment variables, etc. And on the flip side, the operations team, the DevOps team, a platform team, any other kind of stakeholders are able to define what that path to production looks like. Cartographer takes the workload.yaml, which was written by the developer, and the supply chain specification, and essentially combines them on cluster to essentially choreograph all of the different components of the supply chain. The other piece of it is we're built on a choreography model, which allows us to create paths to production that are really flexible and really swappable. So for example, if you wanted to use KPAC for building images, or you wanted to use Conoco, or you wanted to use something else that builds images, you definitely could as part of your path to production. And each of the different steps of the path to prod are incredibly flexible and easily swappable. And so, yeah, at a really high level, that is Cartographer in a nutshell. There's a lot of nuance and a lot of little things that we dive much more deeply into in the documentation. So again, for those of you on the call, I probably know most of this already, but for those of you watching the recording, definitely check out the documentation as well as the repo. And yeah, for interest of time, that's kind of the level that I'll keep it at, and I'll toss it back to David.
Cool, thank you, Daniel. Okay, regarding the agenda itself, remember it's the first time we're doing this, so we have the chance to change things. So yesterday, Rashid, brought up to me some interesting points on kind of everything is becoming open mic, right? So all the items here are basically in the same place. So how to establish priority? I was thinking if how to do it and if we should do it because let's say that a community user puts a question at the end here and it doesn't receive any upvote. We'll still need to listen to them, right? We still need to give them priority. So my short experience with this and also by being part of some upstream communities is that somehow happens organically. It needs to have, the topics here need to have some kind of sections. I don't know if structure that was my original idea with reviewing outstanding IPM items. I don't know if that makes sense. And also having a section for RFCs that also, I don't know if that makes sense. So I would like to know your thoughts briefly around this. Also, this will happen organically throughout the weeks, but if you have some thoughts around how to organize this.
So I'll just jump in as a not cartographer contributor, not yet. For me, what would be helpful is like a high level overview of what's going on. If I can make it to a community meeting once a month or every couple of weeks, having an idea of like what's the overall set of project or works that are going on. I try to attend the SIG-STOR meetings regularly, and they kind of start with a roundtable of the main projects, right? So there's a cosine project and a full CO, and they do a brief update for each of those. And then inside of those sections, they have links to the deep dive topics for specific RFC proposal for this area. And I don't know how Cartographer structured what makes sense the right way there. But for me, like a high level overview of the work and the direction the project is going would be helpful.
Thank you.
And I think that while that's important, I think there's a bunch of us who would like to make sure that this is an opportunity with the community to dive onto deep dive problems that we don't want to do asynchronously. We want to get some consensus on and maybe feedback from broader community. So we need the ability to do both, I guess, is my point.
Okay. We'll keep iterating on this, but yeah, keep your ideas coming, please. Okay, so first thing here that I see is the RFC 10. So I don't know who would like to chime in on this.
Rashima, you're on mute if you're talking.
Not yet. Not yet talking, but I was pulling that up.
Yeah, well, I see this in the RFC section, but if you consider that this one or another RFC is worthy to discuss right now.
Yeah, so RFC10 is an RFC to take the parameters. Right now, we empower a supply chain author or a template author can say, here's a default value. And then a supply chain author can say, all right, I'm either going to ask the developer to fill that param or not. But there's no power for the supply chain author to, in the same way, similar to the template author, there's no way for the supply chain author to say, well, if that's not supplied, here's what the default value should be. And so we've already had users who have asked us and said, this is something that we would need to work around. We would really appreciate being able to do that parameter passing. Similarly, or not similarly, part of the RFC also changes the manner in which we pass parameters from the workload to the supply chain to the template, where we just match on name, where I say, if you've got the name of, if a template is expecting variable foo, then the supply chain just says, like, oh, I've param foo, and because template authors, you can have two template authors that both ask for foo. We need some way to disambiguate for the developer when the developer specifies foo, that the supply chain author may be passing foo to resource A or resource B. So we'll need the developer to specify component, or sorry, resource 1 foo, and then resource 2 foo. That's some of the motivation as well as the intended approach. I don't know.
So I left some comments kind of at the bottom of the RFC. I'm really worried about creating a lot of coupling between the workload and the supply chain. Like I feel like the supply chain should be a way for an operator to create an experience, based on different services, and then those services can offer, together can kind of cooperate to offer configuration in the workload. And so, kind of my proposal at the bottom of that is, could we kind of make that params map and workload sort of a special, easy to access, map. Let operators override that with kind of constant parameters that don't templatize against the workload, so that we can't, so we don't introduce more coupling kind of between those components. So they can still override them, which I think was a goal. Like if you're an operator, you could still override a particular value in this over a template, and then kind of allow defaults in the template as well, so that if you can have a template that has defaults, you don't have to use YTT or come up with a new JSON path notation for defaults. There's still an opportunity for an operator to provide something that looks like a default in the supply chain, but then the developer can still override it through the workload. I'm wondering if that kind of hits enough of those the kind of problems we're facing right now with parameterization. But it wouldn't separate out parameters per template, right?
Sort of requires some orchestration is probably not the right coordination between template authors, some set of idioms that get developed. Maybe we can provide guidance then, but I feel like that would be required. Yeah, I can't jump on an obvious example right now, but I know there are certain variables that you would provide. Like I think classically would be maybe credentials, right? So credentials, here's my service account, and I'm sure that from their perspective, a template author would be like, oh, I just need a service account, so I'll look for the parameter service account, and then that just becomes the one service account, and maybe there needs to be multiple service accounts to satisfy these needs. And I'm guessing that two things could come of that. You could have multiple template authors all say service account, right? Rather than a service account that can get push, service account that can do this, right? And that fine, the person defining the workload would just give a service account, and it would work with all of them if it's broadly applicable. But in a situation where the supply chain author knows that it's not going to be broadly applicable, that they could provide certain suppliers, override certain ones of those params to certain of the templates, and other templates remap them into the workload, so that, because they know that workload users might have to have separate params. So that's one way I can imagine resolving that. But I mean, it's immediately my concern is like when it's something that idiomatically, I just call it something really obvious and then everyone's got that, but unfortunately it's going to be referenced to a different value.
If template authors understand that, you know, the kind of parameters they receive are, you know, going to be top level workload items, that they're not going to be namespaced under the resources, then they can use generic names when they want to accept parameters that are shared, more specific names when they want to accept parameters that are pretty specific to their template. So the namespacing issue, you know, I think creating a simple interface where you don't couple to, you know, KPAC specifically when you're adding parameters, right? That the kind of template authors can, you know, have conventions to, you know, kind of work through. To me, that hits the trade-off a little, you know, or like the trade-off there seems a little bit better than forcing the, you know, workload, the person who writes the workload to know, oh, we're using KPAC in the supply chain, or, oh, I'm supposed to use this generic name that the operator decided represents KPAC in the supply chain, right? I see a lot of drawbacks there. But
yeah, my point is that if we take that approach, we need to document that heavily straight out the gate, because I think we end up with brittleness early if we don't guide template authors.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that one of my concerns is, who do we expect to know about which actors and when? And I don't expect template authors to be aware of other template authors. And I expect them to be the earliest actors in the supply chain, that they write months before the template is actually used. And then conversely, I think of the developer as the last actor and the one that has the most communication from the supply chain author. It knows all the templates that it's referring to, and they can specify to the developer, here are all the fields that you need to fill in, like X, Y, and Z. When we say, I think there's an implicit assumption in what you were saying, that every template author would settle on the same understanding of which variables would be shared and which ones wouldn't be. That doesn't. I think that's something that would work for a little bit.
Yeah, I think I'm as an operator, right? I think it should be really easy to make changes to your supply chain without having to tell all of your developers that they have to modify all of their workloads. Or as a developer who's created an application, you know, that the workload YAML you create, it seems important to be able to take that to different places, right? And then in some instances, there's, you know, there might be a scan that's required, and you might have to provide some configuration for the scanner. In other cases, that scan resource might not be there, right? Like for an image scan, I think, you know, I understand the benefit of having a tight contract, right? And if the goal was, you know, operator creates all of this kind of static infrastructure, and then asks, you know, documents that, then asks developers to bring workloads to that infrastructure, I think it would work well to have more of that namespacing. But, you know, to me, the supply chain is kind of like a drag and drop interface that the operator can kind of change, you know, whenever they want. That's the kind of low configuration to say, these are the services in this environment that an application is going to get built using. And then whatever parameters kind of get brought in through their selection of templates are configurable by the, you know, hopefully don't need very much configuration, but are kind of configurable in a simple way by the developer. And, you know, as long as we set that expectation from the beginning that templates do work on a shared namespace of parameters, then, you know, I think it'll make template authors careful about their choice of parameters they choose, and we can set some standards for parameters that are shared between them too. Like an example of this is like environment variables. You know, they're not namespaced to different, you know, they're kind of inherited through potentially long process tree. They're not namespaced to individual processes that might be running. Some of them are shared between processes, and just kind of a contract that's created between them.
Okay, you got it. Thank you. Anything else regarding RFC 10? Okay, cool. Seems like we'll move into next section, open mic, which is kind of everything else. First thing will be revisit error handling. So, Rashid.
Yeah, and this was one of those things that came up for me in priorities. We talked about this last week in our first of these meetings that was private before we established this open forum. I just want to make sure that previous business we get out of the way. So we spoke about the standards for like finding an idiomatic or standard way of doing error returns and having those errors. I think our intention was to keep stack traces. But from what I can see, the only time we actually saw stack traces must have been coming from people who were using the GitHub package, because the standard Go standard library errors don't log the stack trace, it would seem. So I came up with two proposals. We stick to the standard lib where we lose access to most of the stack trace output in our error logging, unless we're logging third-party errors that are using that GitHub package anyway. Or we can just use, in that case, we just use format error F. We don't need to use errors new. Format F returns the same kind of object. No loss of information because there isn't any stack trace in there. The alternative is we use GitHub's, the package errors on GitHub. So it's less conventional, although I still see plenty of people using it. And it has stack traces. It just gives it to you. And in that case, you use either error F, or errors new. You could probably just use error F for most of them. For originating an error, and for wrapping an error, you use its wrap or wrap F in the same package. So those were my proposals. I'd just like us to decide or talk about it if anyone has any further questions.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just more of a notice really that I think a few other projects have moved away from the GitHub one in favor of the standard lib. I think Kubernetes projects, for example, have. I think.
Yeah, but any idea why? What their reasoning is? I mean, I can see that there's been like this attempt to cover some of the problems that existed in the existing standard library with wrapping, but they did not bring stack trace. And this might go into our logging discussion later, but like the stack trace just gives us absolute context where we might be missing it in our current logging. You have to make sure your logging information is so valuable that your debug is easy. Whereas this is a cheap way to obtain call stack context.
I don't want to detract from the question of, how should we do stack traces? But I think the PKG errors one on GitHub is owned by Dave Cheney. It's not like he just got the PKG username on GitHub. It's not a GitHub specific thing. Yeah. And I don't think he plans to maintain it anymore. It says it's in maintenance mode because it's kind of been superseded by when that functionality got integrated into the standard library. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, no, it does help because I did try to look at it. I mean, I didn't understand who was owning it, and I know it wasn't a GitHub thing. I just, to try and differentiate between that and the standard lib, I use the word GitHub because that's how people write it. Yeah, I mean, so if he's planning on not doing that, then it means to me that we should use the standard lib, happily just use error F and not worry about errors.new. So that's very easy. very straightforward. %w to wrap when you want to, and tackle our contextualization of log errors and that sort of stuff separately in a discussion about logging. Does anyone disagree with that? Because I'll happily write that as the final write-up for this, and maybe even put it in contributing or wherever we think we should place it for style guide. Cool. Thank you.
Cool. Seems like we are moving to the next set of items. Also, Rashid was kind enough to point me to a document for the original discuss meeting, which already had some items there that I took the liberty to move here. I believe those were created by Sam.
Yeah, I think as Rash said, like, you know, we kind of like had a bunch of like talking points that we just kind of had lying around, and I guess I had a few more that came up recently that I just kind of like dumped onto that list. So I can quickly kind of go through these, I suppose. Like, so we've got the Cuddle test naming convention. Right now, we pretty much just have a convention we've been following everywhere where we name all the objects in Cuddle tests. We separate them with dashes, but then we also need to namespace them by the test as well. So they need this like prefix before them. So you can see here, like we have something descriptive that might be like the name of your test and triple dashes, and then something that describes the test object. The problem is that, like, depending on the type of object you've got, like that may be subject to like very restrictive like length. In particular, like some of these will be validated like DNS names, which means like any part that's not delimited between dots is only allowed to be 63 characters. And even so, we can get a max of 255. I think we probably don't want to use more than 255 anyway, because at which point I think the names of the test objects are probably incomprehensible. But 63 is definitely a limit that you can bump up against pretty easily. So what I'm arguing for is to just universally change the right-hand side of the triple dash part to just be like dot delimited, maybe. I don't know, something like that, just so that like you don't keep easily bumping into that, because then you end up like really pruning names and having to abbreviate things sometimes. Honestly, it's very much an aesthetics question. And I think the more interesting piece below is the logging design discussion. But I'll let other folks have the floor first to see if they care about this test naming convention much.
I mean, I think that fourth bullet, that if we use the dot, we don't run into the character limit, is I'm right on board. I think that's I think it's a not nice gotcha for some future devs. So
yeah,
if we switch the convention, it'll help them out.
Yeah, I'll plan a troll to go through and change all the tests just so that it's obvious that that's the approach we're doing.
And add to the contributing guide, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So logging design, this is like something that's just become apparent. We picked up a story recently. So we've had very little requirement in the way before about like what we needed to log. And so we've got some very minimal stuff that just happens to be there when we wrote the code. There's no strict requirements when we have any story about what needs to be logged. And we've just run into a situation recently where we now question what happened in a situation where something unexpected happens related to caching. And so now we're going back and adding logging to the cache, but this logging is pretty verbose. And so, you know, I guess you could say this is the first time we're really adding what we might consider debug logging. And this is kind of like shone a bit of a light on we just happen to be using a logging framework by convention and somewhat equivalent to the errors domain. There's differing views on how logging should be structured that are out there, and varying frameworks and approaches for that. And of course, that kind of begs the question, like, if we're going to start undertaking doing debug logging, what is our approach? How do we want to think about that? Do we want everything to go into one log file? Debugs, logs, terrible. Do they need to go somewhere else? And I think quite potentially we need to think a lot more about the stories that we've got when we're reviewing them. What is the logging use case, right? Who are the stakeholders and what will they care about happening? And of course, one of those stakeholders is us and the support team, right? Yeah. And so I'm arguing for a lot of things here that are all kind of around logging, right? One of them's around like asking us to be more intentful about what goes into the design of the stories, to say what needs to be logged. And then two, I think, is like the investigating like what's a good like technical approach to logging. And it'd be great to get some ideas, and then we can maybe put something formal down in a RFC about logging, perhaps. I don't know.
I think our stories need to specify the kind of log message that a user cares about. So I'm talking about info and error, right? That's important straight off the bat. And for us, debugging as a kind of user, including users who are trying to debug whatever's going wrong, not necessarily needs to be in the story, but needs to exist during a review, that something with a lot more context is applied or is supplied. I would be curious to know, you're talking about logging to different targets for debug. I'd be curious to know if there are conventions out there, because it would be preferable in my mind to have some, like, even if it's a truncated debug log, a debug log actually stored somewhere that can be obtained after the fact, rather than asking a user to reconfigure their deployment to get debug logging turned on so that they can just ask for a pod log, because that would be, after the fact, tends to be painfully hard to recreate. So I'd love to know if there's conventions out there for this. There should be, right?
Yeah. Because if debug went somewhere else, you can like just have it on all the time and have aggressive rotation if it's not like a huge performance impact, right?
Yeah, assuming there's a good standard for that and principles we can follow in the Kubernetes ecosystem. Does anyone know?
What are you all doing on KPAC?
So sorry, was the question this is about debug logging, and if there's another place to put debug logs besides the kind of pod logs? Generally, no. And on KPAC, I think, although I haven't, I'm less familiar with what they're doing recently. I think they use log levels and just allow that to be configurable. And that's usually the common approach. The important thing is that, or like an important way to think about this is when your controller logs, it'll go into pod logs that live on whatever node the kind of pod lives on. But then the customer may set up, community working group, the end user may set up something like Fluent Bid or Fluent D that'll collect pod logs across the cluster and send them to some log storage solution that could keep them permanently. Aside from letting the component be configurable at the log level that it logs at, I don't tend to worry too much. Like I wouldn't log every millisecond or whatever, but I would tend to lean more on verbose logging that a user can really use to identify problems, as opposed to worrying about it, like creating an interface where you're expecting a user to always be looking at the logs, if that sort of makes sense. It's I don't know, James, it seemed like you had some thoughts too.
No, I'd agree. I mean, that's a similar approach that I'm familiar with. Yeah. In fact, I mean, we actually wrapped a logging Loggerus and then enabled some nice environment variables to be able to switch on off debug levels and different types of formatting as well, because you might want to be able to configure like stack driver format so that if you're running on GCP, users might want to have the stack driver level logging and JSON and various different things as well.
Yeah, stack driver is a good point. Like there may be other things at play for logging.
Oh, I don't know what's going on with my mute. There we go. We're currently using the Zap logging that comes like as the default out the gate with Kube Builder and controller runtime. I believe it's configurable for, I mean, it has at least a couple of serializers. So is anyone aware of any concerns we might be, or any corners we might be driving ourselves into using that? Or will that be satisfactory for those kinds of use cases eventually, as far as we know? I mean, it seems pretty commonly used.
Yeah, I think Zap is pretty standard right now. There's an interface library that some people use Zap through, at least KubeBuilder used to use, but I don't know if it still uses it. It's like log, I think, or something. But I think it just changes the interface for Zap.
All right. So I would ask that we document the fact that, I mean, because I'm happy to go with the suggestion we just heard. I don't know how everyone else feels, but it seems like a adequate first step. Let's make sure that we have in our stories some kind of we identify, before the developers deep in the weeds with what they're working on, we identify the kinds of notices we want to hear. All right. The sorts of things a user might expect at when an error occurs, or when there is some information that might be valuable to them about what's going on under the hood. And then debug logging, let's try and get as much context as we can in there and be verbose enough to just like not stress about it, because we know that it can be a configurable level. We can then, instead of stressing about how much information to provide as much as we think is necessary, which is a problem we've had in the past. We've not said enough information. We've made mistakes like naming the component that got stamped out, finding out that everything's got the same name, so we needed more detail, like maybe the whole GVK, and so err on the side of verbose. And we need to capture this maybe in guidelines as well.
Yeah, I think we need to have that more focus, right, on all the error cases, right? What will go wrong? Who needs to know about it? And what info they need, right?
I think the first story is to make sure that we can configure those at least 3 levels of verbosity: error, info, and debug. So a story to make sure that that's configured and something we can, and documented. This is how you configure it to do this level.
Yep. Operation part.
Yeah, as per the Daniel's suggestion to add an action items section, which makes sense. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding for all these logging discussions, what will be action items? I think I understand more identifying and make sure that we are documenting stories. Some of these specifics, but I just wanted to know what will we have as action items for this logging discussion.
So add logging to style guide, contributing guide, and then there's add error handling to they're separate. So duplicate that line, I would say, and one's for logging, another one's for error handling.
Okay.
We log errors. Oh, there's
Yeah.
probably a fun little aside here too, is what I have seen out there in the wild is that people tend to log an error and also return it, which means it gets logged again by controller runtime. No one seems upset with that approach. And it seems safer than trying to dry those results up if everyone's okay with that for now. The idea is you log an error and then you return an error, and it might be logged multiple times up the stack, and that doesn't matter either at this point. It's better to be noisy than to be too quiet.
Thank you, Rashid. Anyone else?
I was just gonna say, follow on the action item suggestion. We should probably save like the past or the last 5 minutes of this meeting just to assign action items to volunteer for action items. Then just make sure that started. That way we can just ensure that issues get created for them. Just another suggestion.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you. Okay, so next one, I don't know if we already touched this, generic realization mode.
Yeah, can we scratch this one? Like when I put this down, this needs like a bit more thought before we can really have a big discussion about it. Like otherwise it'll just be like a big mess.
I will just mention though that there is at least a couple of frameworks for this already out there in the big projects. Knative, Carvel, quite a few people have already got sort of like additional inversions or use something entirely separate to controller runtime. So I want to know whether, when we bring this up, I'd love to have some like decision tree to work out whether we reuse someone else's or build our own because of our specific behavior.
Yeah. I almost don't know enough to have this conversation right now. In fact, I'm almost 2 orders removed from that. So
okay.
but if you can help me get any further along, we can maybe have it.
Yeah, well, let's get an item together for next time to talk about it.
Yeah. But this was too early to put on here. Sorry. So
it's okay, but I just think that it was valuable to make it shared, that we're actually thinking about it. I also think it's safe to duplicate the code so long as the test pass and we've got a product that works. I think it's fairly safe to duplicate the code at the moment because hopefully there won't be yet another realizer for a while now, is my guess. So we've got time.
Yeah,
it would have been nice to,
And so I will say that we probably follow up on next meeting. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Cool. Thank you. And also integration, Cuddle test, transition versus use case.
It was unfair, like it took up all the space of the other half of this meeting. But this is another interesting one because like the Cuddle tests are like, I don't know, they feel like what I would normally call like an acceptance test, but I mean, the way that we write them, they're really, really obtuse. They're hard to reason about like what we would really expect features to be used for, because they just go, oh, well, you know, I just want to see the way that something gets templated out. So I'll just template a config map or a test object. And it's not always obvious to see the big pictures from the Cuddle tests. And I wonder how much that's a good or a bad thing. I don't know. I know we have the end-to-end tests, so maybe that's, you know, just too much of a gripe, but the end-to-end tests are so big that, you know, you don't always see like, you know, very, very many of the feature mapping parts of that.
There was a action item that I took from the last Inception, which I still have every intention to do, which is to sit down and convert a handful of Cuddle tests, probably around one of the smaller sets that we have, probably around delivery or pipeline, to convert them to something a little bit more BDD using Ginkgo, because that's what we're using as our framework, to make them more concise and easier to recognize what they're testing. So I had an action item to try and generate an example of how we would convert them, because we also took from that the feeling that using Cuddle test as our primary form of integration testing made it harder to debug, stop the code, see what was going wrong, understand why the test was written, and extend the tests as well.
Yeah, because normally concision in tests is good, but when it happens in the Cuddle tests, because there's no verbiage and prose around everything, right? You've just got a bunch of YAML documents, right? And they're so concise, you can't understand the narrative anymore.
Yeah. So I feel like we can write concise tests using Gamiga, Ginkgo, and I still think that a handful of use case Cuddle tests are helpful to all of us in the happy path. They're just nice to have because you can quickly just apply them if you want to and play with them, and that they're always there to just very quickly demonstrate basic usage.
Sounds like you started something and I'm just complaining there. So
no, I just think maybe you missed.
Oh, no. I'm just saying, so it sounds
right.
more like we could maybe leap off from like what you've been meddling with, right?
Yeah. I mean, it was just a discussion so far that was at our inception. So it's great to revisit it here in something that is a public forum that at least people can discover later. But yes, I would like to do that chore and make that happen. Maybe that's another thing that we can make sure we cement at the next meeting if we've got time before then, otherwise at a meeting in the future.
This may be a little tangential, but I know Kubernetes still uses Ginkgo and Omega, or at least Ginkgo in some places, but kind of they seem to be moving away from it, and that doesn't seem to be the direction that a lot of kind of open source, Kate's, controller projects are kind of going these days. Do we, is there a reason we really want to stick with Ginkgo and kind of BDD style testing if it kind of makes us look different than other projects? And I'm especially curious to hear from James Rawlings, because I know you've worked on kind of some other large projects in the space. If I'm wrong.
No, I think my general view of tests is just trying to make them as easy as possible so people create lots of them. Reducing the barrier of entry into just writing tests along with the code contributions and having it familiar to what other projects are. Having as much consistency across projects does reduce that barrier, I think. Do you know what they're looking at doing? Just writing just general Go tests with Kubernetes fakes and things like that, I guess. Is it? Yeah. As opposed to, and do we actually do anything with the generated living documentation from the BDD stuff test that we've got at the moment?
It's not that level of BDD. It's not
right.
Cucumber.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the in terms of what's the advantage of sticking with Ginkgo, it's exactly what Sam was bringing up. It's like Ginkgo brings us that that use case understanding.
I would disagree. I would say it does that just because we put use case oriented language in it. We have an example right now where there is one test that is use case oriented, another one which is just context oriented. Given, in this state, this is what's going to happen versus BDD language, which is, the user scenario. So there is, it comes down to how you write the language in your open strings, really. I think you can keep that pattern of describing user experiences even in low-level testing. All right. I was looking at spec with Marty because he mentioned it, which is Stephen's framework. And I was like, I like this not because I don't like Ginkgo, but because it would give me standard runner behavior, which means in the IDE, it would be easier to, IDEs will integrate and tell me this error failed, this error did not, and it would make more sense because most IDEs know how to handle anything that is conventionally a Go test. So I'd be interested in that. This is entirely orthogonal to whether we ditch Cuddle for something that's an in-memory test. So the original thing, just wanted to sort of like draw a line under that. We definitely want to do the work to work out what it would look like to stop using Cuddle and get some in-memory tests going, which I think are more friendly for the most part when doing story-oriented testing. But I would like to see some examples personally of people, because I've looked around to find examples and struggled to find testing that even makes any sense to me personally in the Kubernetes sphere. So I'd love to get feedback from people who have seen successful open source projects that are testing integration level tests well, and I happily take inspiration from that. And I think we should all maybe review that together, rather than, because my situation is the first thing I thought of was Carvel, and I couldn't find any tests. So I know. I'd like to see some great examples.
Speaking from the project I've been working on recently, we tend to do fairly fine-grained unit tests sitting alongside the code. Then we would have a wider set of, I mean, we call them BDD, but they were more, we would actually physically build and deploy a cluster, provision it, and run through some sort of scenarios. For an example, create an application, get it promote. So the behavior of that, making sure that that's kind of that end-to-end behavior isn't adversely affected by that change. That's kind of, but there's a cost to that as well. So you don't want to be doing on every single repo, on every single change, bringing up lots of clusters on different cloud providers as well. So there is I think there's a balance there, but that tends to where we used to do the integration level test. We didn't do too much in Go test. It was more just smaller, fine-grained unit testing.
Yeah, and I think that's a stylistic choice that not all of us are going to be comfortable with, because I, for one, like my regression tests to be at the level that run fast, but actually test an integrated system, not a bunch of things I want to feel comfortable refactoring. Right. So if we can find examples of that, it would be really nice.
To me, the important thing is, like, in the long term, when we have, ideally many more contributors, from different places, that it's really easy to add tests that give us all the coverage that we need, at the integration level, at the unit level, whatever. So I really like the idea of looking at what other projects that have been successful have done and what kind of coverage they have, and just kind of keep an open mind to that. Like we may have our own, a lot of folks, on the team really like or have used BDD and are comfortable with that, in the past, but like balancing that with, what's the right thing for the long-term success of the project when, half people here are working on different things in 3 years or whatever, right? And not just what's, what we'd like to do based on our kind of recent experiences, if that makes sense.
Recent or decades long. But yeah, I hear you. I just, if there's an example where there are integration tests that get you something faster than E to E, I think that's preferable. It still fits the criteria of many people can contribute and add to it, right?
So when you're saying integration tests, I mean, for an example, so we're talking about interacting with Kubernetes, something beyond using like the fake clients that are out there, because
we currently use API server, so we run Kubernetes without being able to generate pods. So that's is it in controller runtime? That's I forget where
it's test-env, right?
Test-env, yeah, I think it's part of controller runtime, right? Or is it part of anyway, wherever it is, we run etcd and an API server. So we can do everything that doesn't involve actually standing up a pod. And that works quite well for our tests. It's submit to the API server, get the results we expect.
I mean, I haven't dived into tests, and that's something I can totally do. But do you use the Kubernetes fake client? Because that's pretty awesome, to be honest.
Kubernetes fake client, but why?
Sometimes is the answer. Sometimes we use counterfeiter, and sometimes we use fake client, depending on our need.
But that's in our unit test, not in our integration test.
But it's still it's talking to an API server, and you can you can apply your resources, you can check in your search, you can actually interact with it like it's an API server. So it was just an interesting viewpoint, really.
Okay.
I'll get to know. I'll dive in and get an understanding. It's more a question, really. So
Yeah. My concern about the fake line is we've already had a couple of situations where we've hit it and its behavior doesn't match what's in the API server. So that I think that's counterpoint to that. It doesn't always behave exactly the same way, and I think it's because it can't. Or you have to emulate the behavior with it rather than just have that behavior come out. So there's something to discuss, something we can deep dive on. But please, let's see examples if anyone's got great experience with well-tested open source products. We can take the lead from those sorts of things. What we're doing is just using our experience with other entirely different products, right? In entirely different scenarios. We're not working as a case controller developer. I've used this or I've used this, and so that's what we've rolled with because it's what we know. But if we can see great examples to follow, that'd be fine. It's just when I've reached out for examples, I've found a dearth of good examples. So it'd be nice to get that.
The session is so interesting that we are way past the time. So hopefully we won't have the chance to discuss live the RFC 13 by Emily. So we'll have to follow up that next meeting, if you don't mind. And also the points that I put here are not anything urgent. So finally, for the action items, we'll ask some of you to please voluntarily take some of those action items. Feel free to add your name to the list. So we can, as Daniel mentioned, so we can create issues and start tracking ways to really make it happen. Okay, so well, again, we're past the time. I really appreciate your time and have a nice day.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Thank you.